The sun beat down mercilessly as he mounted his chestnut stallion, Apache, and continued his journey toward town. After 6 months working cattle drives between Texas and Kansas, Flynn was ready for a hot bath, a Rio bed, and perhaps some feminine company that didn't involve conversation about bovines or trail dust. Sweetwater had grown since he'd last passed through. The railroad had finally reached the town, bringing with it new businesses, new faces, and new opportunities. As Flynn rode down the main street, he couldn't help but notice the appreciative glances thrown his way from the ladies of the town. At 6'2" with sun-bronzed skin, piercing blue eyes, and dark hair that curled just slightly beneath his hat, Flynn Jameson was the kind of man women noticed. And he noticed them right back. "Well, if it ain't the prodigal son returned." The booming voice belonged to Hiram Tucker, owner of the Red Rock Saloon. The older man stood on the wooden boardwalk, arms crossed over his substantial belly. Flynn dismounted with practiced ease. "Hiram. Place looks different. Progress, son. Ain't no stopping it. Got yourself a room at the hotel yet?" "Headed there next." Hiram's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Saturday night social tomorrow. Might want to stay in town for it. Lots of new faces to meet." Flynn knew exactly what the old man was implying. "I'll consider it," he said with a wry smile. "First, I need to wash 6 months of trail off me." After securing Apache at the livery and checking into the Sweetwater Hotel, Flynn spent the remainder of the day reacquainting himself with the town. He settled his accounts at the bank, purchased some much-needed supplies at the general store, and even treated himself to a proper haircut and shave at the barber's. By evening, feeling more human than he had in months, he found himself pushing through the swinging doors of the Red Rock. The saloon was alive with piano music, raucous laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Several card games were in progress, and working girls in colorful dresses circulated among the tables. Flynn had barely reached the bar when a blonde in a red dress sidled up beside him. "Buy a lady a drink, Cowboy?" she purred, running a finger along his freshly pressed shirt sleeve. Flynn offered her a charming smile. "I believe I could manage that, Mississippi." "Loretta," she supplied, batting long eyelashes at him. He was about to order when something caught his attention. "Rather someone?" At the far end of the bar stood Sheriff Wade Ellis, deep in conversation with a woman Flynn had never seen before. She wasn't dressed like the other women in the saloon. Her modest gray dress spoke of propriety, and though Flynn could only see her profile, there was something striking about her delicate features and the dignified way she carried herself. Most notable, however, was the small bundle she cradled in her arms. An infant, couldn't be more than a few months old. "Who's that talking to the sheriff?" Flynn asked, his attention completely diverted from Loretta. The blonde followed his gaze and frowned. "Oh, that's just the widow Ellis. Arrived about 3 months back. Sheriff's sister-in-law. Her husband, his brother, got killed in some mining accident up in Colorado." Flynn watched as the woman adjusted the blanket around her baby with gentle hands. "She working here?" It seemed an odd place for a respectable widow to be. Loretta laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Heavens, no. She's staying with the sheriff, helping at the boarding house to earn her keep. Probably just here to drag him home for supper." She pressed closer to Flynn. "Now, about that drink." But Flynn found his curiosity piqued. There was something about the quiet dignity of the woman, standing in a rowdy saloon with a baby in her arms, that intrigued him far more than Loretta's obvious charms. As if sensing his scrutiny, the widow looked up, her eyes meeting his across the crowded room. For a moment, time seemed to suspend. She didn't smile or look away in embarrassment as many women might have. Instead, she held his gaze with a directness that surprised him. Then, with a slight nod to acknowledge his presence, she turned back to her conversation with the sheriff. "Her name?" Flynn asked, his voice lower than before. "What's her name?" Loretta sighed, clearly annoyed. "Delilah. Delilah Ellis. But you're wasting your time, Cowboy. She's not the type to warm a man's bed, especially not a drifter's." Flynn finally turned his attention back to Loretta, offering her an apologetic smile. I believe I promised you that drink. But even as he signaled the bartender, Flynn found his gaze drawn back to Delilah Ellis and the baby in her arms. Something stirred within him, an unfamiliar feeling he couldn't quite name. Little did he know, that feeling would change the course of his life forever. The following morning, Flynn awoke early, his thoughts still circling around the widow he'd seen in the saloon. He'd managed to avoid ending the night with Loretta or any of the other saloon girls, claiming exhaustion from his travels. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. For some reason, the thought of casual companionship didn't hold its usual appeal. After a quick breakfast at the hotel restaurant, Flynn decided to visit the livery to check on Apache. He asked, flattening his palm as instructed. Flynn nodded, coming around to demonstrate. That's right. Horses have soft lips, but they can't see what's directly in front of their noses too well. He guided the boy's hand. There you go. The mare took the apple delicately, and the boy's face lit up with delight. I did it! You sure did, Flynn agreed. You like horses? The boy nodded enthusiastically. Yes, sir. My uncle lets me help with his sometimes. He's the sheriff. Understanding dawned on Flynn. You must be Sheriff Ellis's nephew then. Yes, sir. I'm Timothy Ellis. But everyone calls me Tim. Before Flynn could introduce himself, a woman's voice called from outside the livery. Timothy Ellis, where have you gotten to? In here, Mama? The boy called back. I'm feeding the horses. A moment later, Delilah Ellis appeared in the doorway of the stables, her baby balanced on her hip. Sunlight streamed in behind her, illuminating the rich chestnut color of her hair, which was pulled back in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Up close, Flynn could see that her eyes were a warm amber color, flecked with gold. She froze when she saw Flynn standing beside her son, recognition flashing across her face. I'm sorry if he's bothering you, sir. Flynn touched the brim of his hat respectfully. No bother at all, madam. We were just getting acquainted with the horses. Flynn Jameson, at your service. Delilah Ellis, she replied, though he already knew her name. Her voice was softer than he'd imagined, with a hint of a southern accent. And you've met my son, Tim? This little one. She adjusted the baby in her arms. Is my daughter, Grace. Flynn found himself staring at the baby, who couldn't have been more than 4 months old. She had her mother's chestnut hair and wide, curious eyes that regarded Flynn without fear. She's beautiful, he said honestly. Both your children are a credit to you, Mrs. Ellis. A slight blush colored Delilah's cheeks. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. Please call me Flynn. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. Tim, we need to get back. I promised Mrs. Holloway we'd help with the noon meal preparations. But Mama, Mr. Jameson was showing me how to feed the horses. Tim protested. Flynn saw an opportunity and seized it. Perhaps, with your mother's permission, I could show you both around the livery another time? Apache here is one of the finest cutting horses in the territory. He patted his stallion's neck. Tim looked hopefully at his mother, who seemed caught between propriety and her son's obvious enthusiasm. That's very kind, Mr. Jameson, but it's no trouble, Flynn assured her. I'm staying in town for a while, taking a break from the trail. Delilah adjusted the baby on her hip, considering. Well, perhaps. Tim does love horses. Excellent. Flynn smiled, directing his words to Tim but keeping his eyes on Delilah. Tomorrow afternoon, after your chores are done? The boy bounced excitedly. Yes, sir. Tim Manners, Delilah reminded him gently. Thank you, Mr. Jameson, the boy added properly. As Delilah led her son away, she glanced back over her shoulder, catching Flynn's eye one last time. There was curiosity there, and perhaps a touch of wariness, but something else too, something that made Flynn's heart beat a little faster. That evening, Flynn found himself at the Saturday social, though for entirely different reasons than Hiram had suggested. The town hall had been decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, and most of Sweetwater's residents were in attendance. A small band played lively tunes while couples danced and others mingled around tables laden with food and punch. Flynn spotted Delilah immediately. She stood with her brother-in-law, the sheriff, holding baby Grace while Tim ran about with the other children. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the warm tones in her hair and skin. Unlike many of the other women, who'd clearly dressed to impress, Delilah's beauty was understated but no less striking. As if sensing his attention, she looked up, meeting his gaze across the room. This time, she offered a small smile of recognition before turning back to her conversation. Flynn made his way around the perimeter of the gathering, exchanging pleasantries with folks he knew from previous visits to town. Several young women tried to catch his attention, but his focus remained on the widow and her children. Finally, he approached where Delilah stood with the sheriff. "Evening, Sheriff Ellis," Flynn greeted, extending his hand. "Flynn Jameson." The sheriff, a stocky man with a serious face but kind eyes, shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Jameson? Heard you were back in town." "Yes, sir. Taking some time between jobs." Flynn turned to Delilah, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Ellis." "Miss Grace." He smiled at the baby, who cooed in response. "Mr. Jameson," Delilah acknowledged. "I hope you're enjoying the social." "It's improved considerably now," Flynn said, his meaning clear in his gaze. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but before she could respond, Tim came bounding up. "Mr. Jameson! Are we still going to see the horses tomorrow?" Flynn grinned down at the boy. "If it's still all right with your mother, absolutely." Sheriff Ellis raised an eyebrow, looking between Flynn and his sister-in-law. "Horses, is it?" Delilah shifted Grace to her other hip. "Mr. Jameson offered to show Tim around the livery. He's quite taken with the horses." "Is he now?" The sheriff's tone was neutral, but his eyes assessed Flynn carefully. "Well, Tim's always had good judgment about people. Gets that from his mother." The band struck up a new tune, a waltz this time. Several couples moved on to the dance floor. Flynn seized the moment. "Mrs. Ellis, would you do me the honor?" He gestured toward the dance floor. Surprise flashed across her face. "Oh, the baby. I can take her," Sheriff Ellis offered unexpectedly, already reaching for his niece. "Go on, Delilah. It's been a long time since you've danced." For a moment, Flynn thought she might refuse. But then she carefully transferred Grace to her brother-in-law's arms and turned to Flynn with a tentative smile. "Very well, Mr. Jameson. One dance." Flynn offered his arm, leading her to the dance floor. When he placed his hand at her waist and took her other hand in his, he was struck by how perfectly she fit against him, as if they'd danced together 100 times before. "You dance beautifully, Mrs. Ellis," he said as they moved in time to the music. "Thank you. Though I'm rather out of practice, I'm afraid." "No one would ever know," he assured her. Up close, he could see the faint freckles across her nose and the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes, signs of laughter and life lived. There was a depth to her that he found utterly captivating. "You've caused quite a stir among the ladies of Sweetwater," Delilah remarked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "I've overheard several discussions about the handsome cowboy who's ridden back into town." Flynn chuckled. "And what do you make of these discussions, Mrs. Ellis?" "I make it a point not to involve myself in town gossip, Mr. Jameson." "Flynn," he reminded her. "And perhaps I'm not interested in the opinions of the ladies of Sweetwater. Perhaps there's only one lady whose opinion matters to me." Her eyes widened slightly, and she missed a step in the dance. Flynn steadied her smoothly. "Mr. Jameson, Flynn," he insisted gently. She met his gaze directly then. "Flynn, I should warn you that I am not looking for companionship. My children are my priority now." "As they should be," he agreed. "But that doesn't mean we can't be friends, does it? Tim clearly needs a male influence in his life, and I'd be honored to show him a thing or two about horses." Delilah studied him for a long moment as they continued to waltz. "You're not what I expected," she finally admitted. "And what did you expect?" A small smile played at her lips. "From what I'd heard, Flynn Jameson doesn't typically spend his time with widows and children when there are other entertainments to be found." Flynn laughed softly. "Maybe Flynn Jameson is discovering there's more to life than other entertainments." The music ended, and they came to a stop, still standing closer than propriety might dictate. For a moment, neither moved away. "Thank you for the dance, Mrs. Ellis," Flynn said, his voice lower than before. "Delilah," she replied softly. "If you're to be Flynn, then I should be Delilah." Flynn smiled, feeling like he'd just won something precious. "Delilah," he repeated, savoring the sound of her name on his lips. As he escorted her back to where the sheriff stood with baby Grace, Flynn Jameson knew with absolute certainty that his stay in Sweetwater was going to be much longer than he'd originally planned. True to his word, the following afternoon Flynn met Delilah and her children at the livery. He'd spent the morning preparing, making sure Apache was groomed to perfection and arranging for the gentlest mare in the stable to be ready for Tim to interact with safely. When they arrived, Tim raced ahead, eager to see the horses, while Delilah followed at a more sedate pace with Grace bundled in her arms. "Good afternoon," Flynn greeted them, unable to keep the smile from his face. "I hope I haven't taken you away from anything important." "The boarding house chores are finished for the day," Delilah assured him. "And honestly, it's nice to have an outing that Tim is so excited about." Flynn nodded toward the baby. "And how's the little lady today?" As if recognizing she was being discussed, Grace gurgled and waved a tiny fist. Delilah laughed, the sound like music to Flynn's ears. "She's in good spirits. She just started sleeping through the night last week, which has been a blessing." "I can imagine," Flynn replied, though in truth he could barely conceive of the demands of caring for an infant alone. He led them to the stall where he'd prepared everything for Tim's first lesson. "Now, Tim, this here is Buttercup. She's one of the gentlest mares you'll ever meet and perfect for learning how to groom a horse properly." Tim's eyes widened with excitement. "Are you going to teach me to ride her?" Flynn exchanged a quick glance with Delilah, who gave a subtle nod of permission. "We'll start with grooming and getting to know her today. If your mama agrees, maybe next time we can try a short ride around the corral." For the next hour, Flynn patiently showed Tim how to brush Buttercup, check her hooves, and feed her properly. The boy was an eager student, absorbing every bit of information like a sponge. Flynn glanced at Delilah, whose expression had grown solemn at the mention of her late husband. "I'm sure he was," Flynn said carefully. "And I'd bet he'd be mighty proud of how well you're learning." Tim nodded seriously, then went back to brushing the mare with renewed concentration. When they'd finished the lesson, Flynn helped Tim return the grooming tools to their proper places, using the opportunity to teach the boy about the importance of keeping equipment organized. "Now remember," Flynn instructed, "always approach a horse from the side where they can see you, speak in a calm voice, and move slowly but confidently." "Yes, sir," Tim replied, his expression earnest. Delilah stood, adjusting Grace in her arms. "What do we say to Mr. Jameson for the lesson, Tim?" "Thank you, Mr. Jameson," the boy said enthusiastically. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Flynn laughed. "Well, that's up to your mother. But I'm here any time you want to learn more." Delilah gave her son an indulgent smile. "Perhaps in a few days. Mr. Jameson has his own affairs to attend to, and we don't want to impose." "It's no imposition at all," Flynn assured her quickly. "In fact," he hesitated, then forged ahead, "I was wondering if you might allow me to take you all on a picnic tomorrow. There's a beautiful spot by the creek just outside of town. Perfect for a Sunday afternoon." Delilah looked surprised at the invitation. "A picnic?" "I promised to provide everything," Flynn added. "You wouldn't have to prepare a thing." Tim was already bouncing with excitement. "Can we, Mama? Please?" Delilah bit her lower lip, clearly torn. "It's very kind of you to offer, but I wouldn't want to give rise to gossip." A widow going on an outing with a single gentleman. Your brother-in-law is welcome to join us," Flynn offered, though the idea of the sheriff chaperoning wasn't exactly what he'd had in mind. "Or anyone else you'd feel comfortable having along." She seemed to consider this, then glanced at her son's hopeful face. "Well, I suppose if we kept it proper." She looked back at Flynn. "Sunday afternoon would be lovely, thank you." Flynn felt a rush of pleasure that seemed disproportionate to such a simple acceptance. "Wonderful. Shall I come by the boarding house around noon?" "That would be fine," Delilah agreed, a small smile playing at her lips. As Flynn watched them leave the livery, Tim chattering excitedly about horses the whole way, he realized he was genuinely looking forward to a family picnic, something he would have scoffed at just a week earlier. There was something about Delilah Ellis and her children that made him want to be a better version of himself, a man worthy of their company. It was an entirely new feeling, and one that both excited and terrified him in equal measure. Sunday dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to take the edge off the Texas heat. Flynn had risen early, wanting to make sure everything was perfect for the picnic. He'd commissioned the hotel kitchen to prepare a basket of fried chicken, cornbread, and apple pie, supplementing it with fresh fruit he'd purchased from a farmer's wagon that morning. He'd even splurged on a bottle of lemonade, a rare treat in these parts. The picnic spot he had in mind was a secluded bend in Sweetwater Creek, shaded by cottonwood trees and carpeted with soft grass, perfect for spreading a blanket and spending a lazy afternoon. When Flynn arrived at the boarding house, he was surprised to find not only Delilah and her children waiting on the porch, but Sheriff Ellis as well. "Afternoon, Jameson," the sheriff greeted, his expression neutral but watchful. Flynn touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Sheriff, will you be joining us for the picnic?" "Just seeing my family off," Ellis replied. "Make sure they're in good hands." The implication was clear. The sheriff was protective of his brother's widow and children. "They couldn't be in better hands," Flynn assured him, meeting the man's gaze directly. "You have my word on that." Something in Flynn's tone must have satisfied Ellis, because he gave a short nod. "See that they're back before sundown." "Yes, sir." Delilah approached, looking lovely in a simple blue calico dress, her hair partially pinned up but with soft tendrils escaping around her face. Grace was bundled in her arms, and Tim bounded down the steps ahead of her. "Is that our picnic?" Tim asked excitedly, pointing to the large basket in Flynn's hand. "It sure is," Flynn confirmed. "And I've got a wagon waiting to take us to the creek." He turned to Delilah. "I thought it might be easier than walking with the little one." Gratitude flickered in her eyes. "That was thoughtful of you." Flynn helped Delilah and the children into the rented wagon, acutely aware of the sheriff's watchful gaze as he did so. With a final nod to Ellis, Flynn climbed up and took the reins, guiding the horses at an easy pace through town and out toward the creek. The spot was just as beautiful as Flynn remembered, with dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves and the gentle sound of water flowing over smooth stones. "Oh, it's lovely," Delilah breathed as Flynn helped her down from the wagon. He spread a large blanket on a patch of grass under the largest cottonwood, then began unpacking the picnic basket while Tim explored the creek bank under his mother's watchful eye. "I hope you like fried chicken," Flynn said as he laid out the food. "The hotel cook assures me it's the best in the county." Delilah settled on the blanket, arranging her skirts modestly. "It looks wonderful. You've gone to such trouble." Flynn waved off her thanks. "It's my pleasure. Truly." As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than Flynn had expected. Delilah told him about growing up in Virginia, meeting her husband Robert at a church social, and their eventual move west when Robert heard about the mining opportunities in Colorado. "We had a good life there," she said softly, watching Tim toss pebbles into the creek. "Until the accident. After Robert died, staying there alone was too difficult." Wade Sheriff Ellis wrote that Sweetwater was growing and that there might be opportunities for me here. So we packed up and came. That must have been hard. Flynn said, his admiration for her quiet strength growing. Traveling with 2 small children on your own. Delilah's gaze dropped to Grace, who was sleeping peacefully on a corner of the blanket. Grace was born just 2 weeks after Robert died. Sometimes I think she was God's way of giving me a reason to keep going. The simple honesty of her words touched something deep within Flynn. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his own. You're remarkable, Delilah Ellis. She looked up, surprise in her amber eyes, but she didn't pull her hand away. I'm just doing what any mother would do, what I must do for my children. Not everyone would handle such loss with the grace you've shown, Flynn insisted. I've known men who've broken under far less. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of the creek and Tim's occasional exclamations as he discovered interesting rocks or water bugs. What about you, Flynn Jameson? Delilah finally asked. What's your story? Flynn leaned back on his elbows, considering. Not nearly as interesting, I'm afraid. Grew up on a small ranch north of here. Lost my parents to fever when I was 16. Been making my own way ever since, cattle drives, breaking horses, whatever honest work I could find. No thoughts of settling down? She asked, and though her tone was casual, something in her expression suggested the answer mattered to her. Flynn looked out over the creek, thinking. Never found a reason to, I suppose. The open trail always seemed to be calling. And now? Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. He turned back to her, meeting her gaze directly. Now I'm starting to think there might be something to be said for putting down roots in the right place. With the right people. A blush colored her cheeks, but before she could respond, Tim came running up, wet to his knees and holding something in his cupped hands. Mama, Mr. Jameson, look what I found! He opened his hands to reveal a small turtle, no bigger than a silver dollar. Well, would you look at that? Flynn said, grateful for the interruption that had saved them both from an intensity neither was quite ready for. That's a painted turtle. See the red markings on his shell? Tim nodded enthusiastically. Can I keep him? Delilah shook her head, though her expression was gentle. Wild creatures belong in the wild, sweetheart. He has a home here by the creek. The boy's face fell, and Flynn quickly intervened. Your mama's right, Tim. But tell you what, we can build him a little pen of stones right by the water's edge, give him some food, and come visit him whenever we return to the creek. How does that sound? Tim considered this compromise, then nodded. All right. But we have to come back soon to check on him. I think that can be arranged, Flynn said, glancing at Delilah for confirmation. The smile she gave him warmed him more than the afternoon sun ever could. They spent the rest of the afternoon helping Tim build a small enclosure for the turtle, which he named Sheriff, much to their amusement, skipping stones across the creek's surface, and simply enjoying each other's company. When Grace awoke, Flynn was surprised to find himself volunteering to hold her while Delilah repacked the picnic basket. The baby regarded him solemnly with her big eyes, then reached up to grab his finger with surprising strength. She likes you, Delilah observed, watching them with a soft expression. The feeling's mutual, Flynn replied, gently bouncing Grace in his arms. The weight of her, so small and trusting, stirred feelings in him he hadn't known existed. As promised, they headed back to town well before sunset. When they reached the boarding house, Sheriff Ellis was waiting on the porch, looking relieved to see them return. Flynn helped Delilah down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Thank you for a wonderful afternoon, he said quietly. It was lovely, she agreed, her eyes meeting his. Tim hasn't had so much fun in a long time. Just Tim? Flynn couldn't help asking, a hint of teasing in his voice. Her smile was answer enough. Good night, Flynn Jameson. Good night, Delilah Ellis, he replied, touching his hat brim. I'll see you soon. As he drove the wagon back toward the livery, Flynn realized he hadn't thought once about moving on from Sweetwater all day. For the first time in his adult life, the open trail held less appeal than the possibility of staying put. Over the next 3 weeks, Flynn found himself spending more and more time with Delilah and her children. He continued Tim's horse riding lessons, eventually graduating the boy to short rides around the livery corral on Buttercup. They returned to the creek twice more to check on Sheriff, the turtle, each visit ending with a picnic that felt increasingly like a family outing. When he wasn't with them, Flynn found himself thinking about them, wondering if Grace was sleeping through the night, if Tim was remembering to approach horses from the side, if Delilah had managed to get any rest amid her many responsibilities. The townsfolk had begun to notice, of course. Flynn caught the knowing looks, heard the whispers that sometimes stopped when he entered a room. Some seemed amused by the notorious ladies' man spending his time with a widow and her children, while others, particularly several unmarried women, seemed less than pleased with this development. Flynn found, to his surprise, that he didn't much care what anyone thought. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, he was at the general store purchasing supplies when he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. "I give it another week before he's bored and moves on," a woman's voice said from the next aisle over. "Men like Flynn Jameson don't change their spots. He's just amusing himself with the Ellis widow until something more exciting comes along. Or until she gives him what he's after," another voice added with a snicker. "Though she plays the proper widow so well, doesn't she? Poor thing probably doesn't even realize she's just another conquest to him. You know his reputation." Flynn stepped around the corner, facing the two gossiping women directly. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, and Miss Clark, the milliner's daughter, both had the grace to look embarrassed at being caught. "Ladies," Flynn said, his voice icier than either had likely ever heard it, "I'd appreciate it if you'd keep Mrs. Ellis's name out of your conversations. She's a fine woman raising 2 children alone after losing her husband, and she deserves your respect, not your speculation." Mrs. Peterson recovered first. "We meant no harm, Mr. Jameson. We're simply concerned. Mrs. Ellis is vulnerable, and your reputation with ladies is well established." Flynn's jaw tightened. "My past is my own business. But let me be clear, my intentions toward Mrs. Ellis and her children are honorable. I'd thank you to remember that before spreading gossip that could harm her standing in this community." Without waiting for a response, he paid for his purchases and left the store, his mood darkened by the encounter. The women's words had struck a nerve, not because they were right about his intentions, but because they'd voiced his deepest fear that his reputation would somehow tarnish Delilah's. Lost in thought, Flynn almost collided with Sheriff Ellis on the boardwalk. "Whoa there, Jameson," Ellis said, steadying him. "You look like a man with something heavy on his mind." Flynn hesitated, then decided directness was the best approach. "Sheriff, can I have a word with you? In private?" Ellis raised an eyebrow but nodded. "My office is just down the street." Once they were inside the sheriff's office, Ellis poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for Flynn to take a seat. "What's on your mind?" Flynn set his cup down without drinking. "I want to speak to you about your sister-in-law." "I figured as much," Ellis said, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a considerable amount of time with her and the children." "Yes, sir, I have. And I intend to continue doing so, with your blessing." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You're not exactly the settling down type, Jameson. Delilah's been through enough heartache already." "I know my reputation precedes me," Flynn acknowledged. "But people can change when they have reason to. Delilah and those children, they're my reason." Ellis leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Are you telling me your intentions are honorable?" "Completely," Flynn said without hesitation. "I care for Delilah deeply. And for Tim and Grace as well. I know it might seem sudden, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "And what exactly are your plans?" "You're a drifter, Jameson. Always have been. Delilah needs stability, not someone who'll ride off when the trail calls again." Flynn nodded, accepting the criticism as fair. "I've been giving that a lot of thought. I've saved a fair bit over the years. There's a small ranch for sale about 10 miles south of town, the old Henderson place. It needs work, but the land is good, and it's not too far from town for Tim's schooling. Ellis's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You're thinking of buying a ranch? Settling down permanently? Yes, sir, I am. Flynn met the sheriff's gaze directly. I've already spoken to the bank about it. I'm just waiting for the paperwork to be finalized. The sheriff sat back, clearly reassessing the man before him. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. You're serious about this? I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Flynn confirmed. But I wanted to speak with you first, out of respect for you and for Robert's memory. I know I can never replace him in Tim and Grace's lives, but I want to be there for them. For all of them. Ellis was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, he said, Robert would have wanted Delilah to be happy. The children to have a father figure. If you're truly committed to this path. He paused, then gave a small nod. You have my blessing to court her properly. Relief washed over Flynn. Thank you, Sheriff. I promise you won't regret it. See that I don't. Ellis warned, though there was a hint of warmth in his voice now. Delilah's not just my brother's widow, she's family. And in case you haven't noticed, this town protects its own. I've noticed, Flynn said with a smile. It's one of the reasons I want to make it my home. As Flynn left the sheriff's office, his steps felt lighter than they had in years. He had a plan now, a future taking shape before him that looked nothing like the solitary trail life he'd always known, and he couldn't wait to embrace it. The opportunity to speak with Delilah alone came sooner than Flynn expected. That evening, he received a message at his hotel room. Sheriff Ellis had been called away to handle a situation in a neighboring town, and would be gone overnight. Delilah had asked if Flynn might be willing to escort her and the children to the church social the following evening, as she didn't feel comfortable attending alone with the children. Flynn sent back an immediate acceptance, his heart beating faster at the prospect of spending more time with her. The next day, he found himself standing on the boarding house porch at precisely 6 o'clock, dressed in his best clothes, his hat in his hands. Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house proprietor, answered his knock. Evening, Mr. Jameson, she said, eyeing him appraisingly. My, don't you clean up nice. Thank you, madam, Flynn replied politely. I'm here to escort Mrs. Ellis and her children to the church social. So I heard, Mrs. Holloway said with a knowing smile. She'll be down directly. Come in and wait in the parlor. Flynn had barely settled onto the stiff sofa when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Looking up, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Delilah descended the staircase with Grace in her arms and Tim following behind. She wore a dress Flynn hadn't seen before, a deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her amber eyes. Her chestnut hair was arranged in an elegant twist with a few curls framing her face. She looked, quite simply, beautiful. Flynn rose to his feet, suddenly feeling tongue-tied as a schoolboy. Delilah, he managed. You look remarkable. A blush colored her cheeks. Thank you, Flynn. It's just an old dress I haven't had occasion to wear in some time. It suits you perfectly, he assured her, then grinned down at Tim, who was fidgeting in his Sunday best. And don't you look like a proper gentleman, Tim? The boy tugged at his collar. These clothes itch. Flynn laughed. That they do, partner. But sometimes we endure a little discomfort to make the ladies happy. Tim considered this wisdom, then nodded seriously. I guess that's fair. With Mrs. Holloway's approving eye upon them, Flynn offered Delilah his arm and led her and the children out to the waiting buggy he'd rented for the evening. The church was only a few blocks away, but he hadn't wanted Delilah to have to walk with Grace in her arms. The social was already in full swing when they arrived, the church hall decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. Several people turned to look as they entered, and Flynn noticed more than a few curious glances and whispered conversations. But Delilah held her head high, and Flynn felt a surge of pride to be escorting her. Mrs. Ellis, so lovely to see you. Reverend Parker greeted them warmly. And Mr. Jameson, what a pleasant surprise. We don't often see you at church functions. I'm trying to improve my character, Reverend. Flynn replied with a smile that made the older man chuckle. Well, you're in excellent company for that endeavor, the minister said, nodding toward Delilah. They made their way through the hall, stopping to chat with various townspeople. Flynn was pleased to notice that most seemed genuinely happy to see Delilah enjoying herself, though he didn't miss the speculative glances cast their way. When the music started, Flynn turned to Delilah. Would you care to dance? I believe Mrs. Holloway would be happy to watch Grace for a few minutes. The older woman was indeed hovering nearby, clearly eager to hold the baby. Delilah hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd like that. After transferring Grace to Mrs. Holloway's eager arms and making sure Tim was happily occupied with the other children, Flynn led Delilah to the dance floor. As before, the moment his hand settled at her waist, it felt perfectly natural, as if they'd been dancing together for years. People are watching us, Delilah murmured as they moved to the music. Let them, Flynn replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I'm proud to be seen with you, Delilah. I hope you know that. She searched his face, as if looking for something. Flynn, I've heard things. About you. About your past with women. Flynn's steps faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. I can't deny that I've lived a somewhat unattached life. But that was before I met you. Before Tim and Grace. And now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Flynn guided her into a turn before answering. Now I find myself thinking about a future I never imagined wanting. A home. A family. He paused, gathering his courage. Delilah, I need to tell you something. I've purchased the Henderson Ranch south of town. Surprise widened her eyes. You've bought a ranch? Here in Sweetwater? Flynn nodded. The papers were finalized yesterday. It needs work, but it's good land. Room for cattle, horses. He hesitated, then added softly. Room for a family to grow. Understanding dawned in her expression. Flynn. I'm not asking for anything right now, he assured her quickly. I know it's too soon. I just wanted you to know that I'm staying. That I'm committed to building something here. The music ended, but they remained standing close together, the rest of the room seeming to fade away. Would you and the children come see it with me tomorrow? Flynn asked. I'd value your opinion on what needs to be done to make it livable. Delilah's eyes searched his, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded. We'd like that very much. Before Flynn could respond, Tim came running up. Mama, they're serving cake now. Can I have some? The moment broken, Delilah smiled down at her son. Yes, but just one piece. And mind your manners. As they followed Tim toward the refreshment table, Flynn felt Delilah's hand slip into his. It was a small gesture, but in the context of the conservative community and Delilah's careful propriety, it felt monumental. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Flynn found himself genuinely enjoying the community gathering, something he would have avoided in the past. He chatted with local farmers about cattle prices, discussed the upcoming harvest with the general store owner, and even managed a civil conversation with Mrs. Peterson, whose earlier gossip he chose to forgive in light of her genuine kindness toward Delilah. By the time they left, Grace was fast asleep in Delilah's arms, and Tim was yawning widely despite his protests that he wasn't tired at all. The buggy ride back to the boarding house was quiet, Tim nodding off against his mother's side while Flynn drove. As they pulled up in front, Flynn helped Delilah down, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. I'll carry Tim, he offered, easily lifting the drowsy boy into his arms. Tim instinctively wrapped his arms around Flynn's neck, murmuring something unintelligible before drifting back to sleep. Mrs. Holloway met them at the door, tooting sympathetically at the sleeping children. Looks like someone had quite the evening. Let me take Grace while you get Tim settled, Delilah. After helping Delilah get the children to bed, Flynn found himself alone with her in the small sitting room that the boarding house residents shared, though at this hour, everyone else had retired. Thank you for tonight, Delilah said softly, sitting beside him on the worn sofa. Tim had a wonderful time. We all did. The pleasure was all mine, Flynn assured her. Truly. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Flynn, Delilah finally said, her voice hesitant. What you said earlier about the ranch. About building something here. Flynn took her hand in his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. I meant every word, Delilah. I know my past doesn't exactly recommend me as a family man, but meeting you and your children has changed everything for me. I want to be the kind of man who deserves a family like yours. And what if? She paused, gathering her courage. What if I said I might be open to the possibility of us being a family? Someday. Hope surged through Flynn's chest, making it hard to breathe for a moment. Flynn reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. When she leaned slightly into his touch, he felt emboldened to cup her face gently in his hand. Delilah Ellis, he said, his voice low and fervent. I believe I'm falling in love with you. Her eyes widened, but before she could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was soft, reverent, and achingly tender. For a moment she remained still, and Flynn feared he'd overstepped. But then her hand came up to rest against his chest, and she returned the kiss with a sweetness that made his heart soar. When they parted, Delilah's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes shone with emotions too complex to name. I should. It's getting late, she murmured, though she made no move to rise. Flynn nodded, reluctantly letting his hand fall from her face. Of course. Will you still come to the ranch tomorrow? All of you? Yes, she said, her smile returning. We'd like that very much. Flynn stood, offering her his hand to help her up. I'll come by after church then. Around noon? We'll be ready, she promised. At the door, Flynn turned back to her. Good night, Delilah, he said softly, wanting nothing more than to kiss her again but restraining himself. As if reading his thoughts, Delilah rose on her tiptoes and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. Good night, Flynn. As he walked back to the hotel under a star-filled Texas sky, Flynn Jameson knew with absolute certainty that his days of drifting were over. For the first time in his life, he had found someone worth staying for. The Henderson Ranch looked different in Flynn's eyes now that it was officially his property. What had been a run-down homestead the day before now represented possibility, future, hope. He'd risen at dawn, too excited to sleep, and had ridden out to begin assessing what needed to be done before he could bring Delilah and the children to see it. The main house was solid but neglected, a 2-story structure with a wide front porch that wrapped around one side. Inside there were 4 bedrooms upstairs and a spacious living area and kitchen downstairs. The previous owners had left in a hurry after Mr. Henderson's sudden death, and much of the furniture remained, covered in dust cloths. The barn needed the most work. A portion of the roof had collapsed during the previous winter storms, but the corrals were in decent shape, and the well provided clean, sweet water. All in all, Flynn was pleased with his purchase. With some hard work and investment, it could be a fine home and a productive ranch. He spent the morning sweeping out the house and airing the rooms, wanting it to look its best for Delilah's first visit. Around 11, he rode back to town, stopping at the hotel to change into clean clothes before heading to the boarding house. Sheriff Ellis had returned from his trip and was sitting on the porch with Tim when Flynn arrived. Afternoon, Sheriff, Flynn greeted, dismounting from Apache. How was your trip? Productive, Ellis replied, giving Flynn an appraising look. Heard you took my sister-in-law to the church social last night. Yes, sir. Had a fine time, too. Flynn met the sheriff's gaze directly. I'm taking them out to see the ranch today. Ellis nodded slowly. So you went through with the purchase? Signed the papers yesterday, Flynn confirmed. Property's officially mine. Before the sheriff could respond, Tim spotted Flynn and came bounding down the steps. Mr. Jameson! Are we going to see your ranch now? Flynn ruffled the boy's hair. That's the plan, partner. Is your mama ready? She's getting Grace dressed. She told me to wait outside so I wouldn't get my good clothes dirty before we left. Tim looked down at his Sunday outfit with a grimace that made both men chuckle. The door opened, and Delilah appeared with Grace in her arms. She wore a simple blue dress with a shawl draped over her shoulders against the slight autumn chill. Her hair was pinned up neatly, but a few tendrils had escaped, framing her face. The sight of her made Flynn's heart skip a beat. "Good afternoon, Flynn," she greeted, a slight blush coloring her cheeks as their eyes met. "Delilah," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "You look lovely." Sheriff Ellis cleared his throat pointedly. "I'll expect you all back by supper time," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a suggestion. "Of course, Wade," Delilah assured him. "We'll be back in plenty of time." Flynn had borrowed a small wagon for the occasion, knowing Apache couldn't carry all four of them. He helped Delilah and the children into it, then climbed up and took the reins, acutely aware of the sheriff's watchful gaze as they set off. Once they were out of town, Flynn relaxed slightly, turning to smile at Delilah beside him. "Your brother-in-law is quite protective. He means well," she said, adjusting Grace on her lap. "Wade promised Robert he'd look after us if anything happened to him. He takes that promise very seriously." "As he should," Flynn agreed. "You're fortunate to have family who cares so much." Tim, sitting behind them, leaned forward eagerly. "Are there horses at your ranch, Mr. Jameson?" "Not yet," Flynn replied. "But there will be. I'm thinking about breeding quarter horses eventually. Maybe you could help me pick out the first ones." Tim's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? Can I, Mama?" Delilah laughed, the sound light and musical. "Let's see the ranch first before making any decisions, shall we?" The 10-mile journey passed pleasantly, with Tim asking endless questions about ranching and horses, and Flynn doing his best to answer. Delilah remained somewhat quiet, but Flynn caught her watching him with Tim, a soft expression on her face that gave him hope. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Flynn felt a surge of pride mixed with nervousness. It wasn't much to look at, yet the house needed paint, the barn was partially collapsed, and the corral stood empty, but all he could see was what it could become. "There it is," he said, gesturing toward the property spread out before them. "The Henderson place. Or I suppose it's the Jameson place now." Delilah shaded her eyes against the sun, taking in the sight. "It's larger than I expected. 160 acres, Flynn confirmed. Most of it good grazing land. The creek running through the back portion provides year-round water." As they drove down the hill and through the open gate, Flynn pointed out various features: the best pastures, the old orchard that needed tending, the spot where he thought a kitchen garden would thrive. Tim was practically bouncing with excitement by the time they pulled up in front of the house. "Can I explore? Please? Stay where we can see you," Delilah cautioned as Flynn helped them down from the wagon. While Tim ran to investigate the corrals, Flynn offered Delilah his arm. "Would you like to see the house?" She nodded, adjusting Grace on her hip. "Lead the way." Flynn had left the front door open to air out the musty smell, and sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. "It needs a good cleaning," he acknowledged, "and some repairs. But the structure is sound." He led her through the downstairs, the large front room with its stone fireplace, the dining area with built-in cupboards, and the kitchen with its cast-iron cookstove and pump at the sink. "Running water," Delilah remarked, sounding impressed. "That's a luxury. Mr. Henderson installed it for his wife a few years back," Flynn explained. "There's a windmill that pumps water from the well to a tank on the roof." Upstairs, he showed her the 4 bedrooms, the large master at the back of the house with views of the distant hills, and 3 smaller rooms along the hallway. "This one gets the morning sun," Flynn said, opening the door to one of the smaller rooms. "I thought, well, it might make a nice nursery for Grace." Delilah looked at him sharply, and Flynn realized what he'd implied. I mean if... that is... he stammered, uncharacteristically flustered. A small smile played at Delilah's lips. It would make a lovely nursery, she agreed softly. The light is perfect. Relief washed over him, followed by a surge of hope. The furniture comes with the property, though I expect you'd want to bring your own things, make it truly yours. The word yours hung in the air between them, its meaning clear. Flynn wasn't just showing her a house, he was offering her a home. Their home, if she wanted it. Grace began to fuss, breaking the moment. She's probably hungry, Delilah said, gently bouncing the baby. Is there somewhere I can feed her? Flynn led her back to the master bedroom, where a rocking chair sat near the window. Would this do? I'll go check on Tim, give you some privacy. Thank you, Delilah said, settling into the chair. As Flynn turned to leave, she added, Flynn? It's a beautiful home. The simple words filled his heart with joy. I'm glad you think so. Outside, Flynn found Tim in the corral, balancing on the bottom rail of the fence. This is where the horses will go, right, Mr. Jameson? That's right, Flynn confirmed, leaning against the fence beside him. What do you think of the place, Tim? The boy looked around thoughtfully. It's big. Bigger than our house in Colorado. And it has a creek. Can I fish in it? Any time you want, Flynn promised. There are some fine trout in there. Tim was quiet for a moment, then asked, Are we going to live here with you, Mr. Jameson? The directness of the question took Flynn by surprise. Well, that would be up to your mama, Tim. But you want us to, don't you? The boy's perception was uncanny. Flynn saw no reason to lie. Yes, Tim, I do. Very much. Tim nodded, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. I think Mama wants to, too. She smiles more when you're around. A warmth spread through Flynn's chest at the boy's words. Does she now? Uh-huh. And last night, after we got home from the social, I heard her crying. But not sad crying. She told Mrs. Holloway she was just happy. Tim looked up at Flynn earnestly. You make her happy? Flynn had to swallow hard against the emotion that rose in his throat. She makes me happy too, Tim. You all do. Tim seemed satisfied with this answer. If we live here, can I have a horse of my own? A real one, not just riding Buttercup at the livery? Flynn chuckled. I think that could be arranged. When you're a bit older and have shown you can handle the responsibility. I'm responsible, Tim insisted. I always do my chores at the boarding house without Mama having to ask twice. That's a good start. Flynn agreed. How about we make a deal? You keep showing how responsible you are, and once we've got the ranch up and running properly, we'll find you the perfect horse. Tim stuck out his hand solemnly. Deal. Flynn shook the small hand, marveling at how easily the boy had worked his way into his heart. He'd never given much thought to fatherhood before, but now he couldn't imagine his life without Tim's enthusiasm and Grace's sweet smile. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property together. Flynn showed Tim the creek and promised to teach him to fish properly. They examined the old orchard, where apple and peach trees grew in neat rows, though they needed pruning. When Delilah rejoined them with a now contented Grace, they spread a blanket under the shade of a massive oak tree and enjoyed the simple picnic Flynn had packed. As the afternoon waned, Flynn found himself increasingly reluctant to return to town. This day Delilah and the children at the ranch, sharing a meal under the oak tree, planning for future harvests, and horses felt right in a way nothing in his life ever had before. But he'd promised the sheriff they'd be back by supper time, and Flynn had no intention of giving Ellis any reason to doubt his word. Reluctantly, he began packing up the picnic things as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We should head back soon, he said, helping Delilah fold the blanket. Don't want to worry your brother-in-law. Delilah nodded, though she too seemed reluctant to leave. Yes, Wade will be waiting. As they walked back toward the wagon, Tim ran ahead with boundless energy while Flynn and Delilah followed at a more sedate pace, Grace asleep in her mother's arms. "What did you think of the place?" Flynn asked, trying to keep his voice casual though the answer meant everything to him. Delilah was quiet for a moment, considering. "It has wonderful potential," she finally said. "It feels peaceful. Like a place where a family could be happy." "That's exactly what I thought when I first saw it," Flynn agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Delilah, I know it's too soon, perhaps, but I want you to know that everything I'm doing, all the plans I'm making for this ranch, they all include you. You and Tim and Grace." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Flynn, I'm not asking for an answer today," he hastened to add. "I know you need time. I know there are considerations. You're standing in the community, what people might say." "I don't care what people say," Delilah interrupted, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. "I've spent the past year doing what was expected of me, the proper widow, the dutiful sister-in-law. And I'm grateful for Wade's support, truly I am. But—" She trailed off, looking toward the house, the barn, the rolling pastures beyond. "When Robert died, I thought my chance at happiness died with him. I resigned myself to a life of just getting by. Doing what was best for the children." Flynn waited, hardly daring to breathe. "But then you came along," she continued, her amber eyes meeting his. "With your easy smile and your kindness to Tim. The way you hold Grace like she's the most precious thing in the world. The way you look at me. Like I'm not just a widow with responsibilities, but a woman." Flynn reached out, gently taking her free hand in his. "You are a woman, Delilah. The most remarkable woman I've ever known." She smiled, a full, radiant smile that took his breath away. "What I'm trying to say, Flynn Jameson, is that I believe I'm falling in love with you too." Joy surged through Flynn so powerfully that he thought his heart might burst. Without thinking, he stepped forward and kissed her, one hand cradling her face while the other supported her arm holding Grace. The kiss was deeper than their first, filled with promise and hope and the beginnings of a passion that both knew would only grow with time. When they parted, Delilah's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes shone with emotion. "We should go," she whispered, "before Tim comes looking for us." Flynn nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "But we'll continue this conversation soon?" "Very soon," she promised. The ride back to town was filled with Tim's excited chatter about the ranch and all the adventures he planned to have there. Flynn and Delilah exchanged occasional glances, their shared secret warming the cooling evening air. As promised, they arrived at the boarding house well before sundown. Sheriff Ellis was waiting on the porch, his expression softening at the sight of his nephew's animated face. "Had a good time, did you?" he asked as Flynn helped them down from the wagon. "The best, Uncle Wade!" Tim exclaimed. "Mr. Jameson's ranch has a creek with fish, and an orchard, and he said I can have my own horse someday if I'm responsible." Ellis raised an eyebrow at Flynn, who shrugged with a smile. "We had a man-to-man talk about responsibility." "I see," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested he saw more than Flynn had intended to reveal. "Well, Mrs. Holloway has supper waiting, so go on inside and wash up, Tim." The boy hugged Flynn impulsively before running inside. "Bye, Mr. Jameson. Thank you for showing us your ranch." Delilah lingered on the porch, Grace still asleep in her arms. "Thank you, Flynn. For everything." "My pleasure," he replied, meaning it more deeply than words could express. Perhaps we could talk more tomorrow? I'll be in town, meeting with some suppliers about materials for the barn repairs." "I'd like that," she said softly. "Good night, Flynn." "Good night, Delilah." Flynn touched his hat brim, then turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff Ellis." Ellis nodded, his expression unreadable. "Jameson." As Flynn drove the wagon back toward the livery, he couldn't help but feel the sheriff's eyes on his back. The man's approval mattered not just because he was Delilah's guardian of sorts, but because Flynn genuinely respected him. Somehow, Flynn knew, he would need to prove to Ellis that his intentions toward Delilah were honorable and permanent. But first, he needed to make those intentions absolutely clear to Delilah herself. With that thought firmly in mind, Flynn began planning what came next. Over the next 2 weeks, Flynn divided his time between working on the ranch and courting Delilah properly. Every morning, he rode into town to have breakfast with her and the children at the boarding house before heading out to the property to work on repairs. He hired local men to help rebuild the barn, determined to have it finished before the first winter storms. In the evenings, he would often join Delilah and the children for supper, sometimes at the boarding house and sometimes at the small cafe on Main Street. Afterward, while Tim played with the other children and Grace slept in her basket, Flynn and Delilah would sit on the boarding house porch, talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their hopes for the future. Flynn found himself sharing things he never told another soul about the loneliness of the trail, the emptiness he'd felt despite his carefree reputation, the yearning for something more substantial that he'd never been able to name until he met her. Delilah, in turn, confided her fears about raising her children alone, her grief over Robert's death, and her guilt at finding happiness again so soon. Flynn listened, offering comfort when needed and understanding always. With each passing day, their connection deepened, and Flynn became increasingly certain that what he felt for Delilah was not just love but a soul-deep recognition, as if he'd been searching for her his entire life without knowing it. The town noticed, of course. The notorious ladies' man walking out with the respectable widow was fodder for gossip, but to Flynn's surprise, most of the talk seemed supportive rather than scandalous. Perhaps it was the obvious way Flynn doted on Tim and Grace, or the way Delilah had begun to smile more freely, but the community appeared to be cautiously approving of the match. Even Sheriff Ellis had softened his stance, inviting Flynn to Sunday dinner and engaging him in discussions about the ranch's development that went beyond mere polite interest. One crisp October afternoon, Flynn was on the roof of the ranch house, replacing damaged shingles, when he heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Shading his eyes against the sun, he was surprised and delighted to see Delilah driving, with Tim beside her and Grace secured in a basket at their feet. "Well, this is an unexpected pleasure," Flynn called down as he made his way to the ladder. By the time he reached the ground, Tim had already jumped from the wagon and was running toward him. "We brought you lunch, Mr. Jameson," the boy announced. "Mama made fried chicken and apple pie." "Did she now?" Flynn grinned, helping Delilah down from the wagon. "To what do I owe this honor?" Delilah smiled, looking somewhat bashful. "Tim wanted to see how the barn repairs were coming along, and I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal for a change." "I most certainly do," Flynn assured her, taking Grace's basket from her. "The barn's nearly finished, Tim. Want to see?" While Tim raced ahead to inspect the progress, Flynn walked alongside Delilah, carrying Grace's basket. "This is a wonderful surprise," he said softly. "I've missed you all today." "We've missed you too," she admitted. "The boarding house feels empty when you're not there." The simple confession warmed Flynn's heart. They'd reached a point in their courtship where their feelings were clear, but neither had spoken of the future directly since that day at the ranch 2 weeks earlier. After showing Tim the rebuilt barn and the 2 horses, Flynn had purchased a gentle bay mare for everyday riding and a sturdy plow horse for farm work. They settled on the front porch for the picnic Delilah had brought. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect for an outdoor meal. "This is delicious," Flynn said appreciatively as he bit into a piece of perfectly fried chicken. "You're a wonderful cook, Delilah." She smiled, pleased by the compliment. "It's nice to cook for someone who enjoys it so much. The boarding house meals are adequate, but Mrs. Holloway doesn't believe in what she calls unnecessary seasonings." Flynn laughed. "Well, I believe in all the seasonings. He caught himself, realizing what he'd been about to say, "when you're cooking here at the ranch." Taking a breath, he changed course. "I mean, this is truly the best chicken I've ever had." But Delilah had caught his slip. Her eyes met his, a question in their depths that Flynn suddenly felt ready to answer. "Tim," he said, turning to the boy who was happily munching on a biscuit, Would you mind checking on the horses for me? Make sure they have water in their trough? Tim nodded eagerly, always happy for an excuse to visit the horses. Yes, sir. As the boy ran off toward the corral, Flynn turned back to Delilah. Grace was awake in her basket, watching the world with curious eyes. Flynn reached down and let her grasp his finger, marveling as always at her tiny, perfect hand. Delilah, he began, his heart pounding. These past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Being with you and the children, working on the ranch, building something. It feels right in a way nothing ever has before. She watched him, her amber eyes soft with emotion. It feels right to me too, Flynn. Encouraged, he continued. I know it hasn't been long, and I know there are those who might think we're rushing things. But the truth is, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He took a deep breath. I love you, Delilah Ellis. I love Tim and Grace as if they were my own. And I want us to be a family here, at the ranch, for the rest of our days. Tears welled in Delilah's eyes. Are you? Is this a proposal, Flynn Jameson? Flynn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. It is, he confirmed, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant gold ring with a small diamond at its center. I've had this for a week now, waiting for the right moment. I realize this might not be the most romantic setting, me covered in dust from roofing, you with chicken grease on your fingers, but somehow it feels perfect anyway. A laugh bubbled up through Delilah's tears. It is perfect. Perfectly us. Hope surged in Flynn's chest. Is that a yes, then? Instead of answering directly, Delilah glanced toward the corral where Tim was dutifully checking the water trough. Tim, she called. Could you come here for a moment? The boy came running back, looking curious. Yes, Mama? Delilah exchanged a look with Flynn before turning to her son. Sweetheart, Mr. Jameson has asked if me, and Grace would like to become his family. To live here at the ranch with him, as a proper family. Tim's eyes widened. You mean Mr. Jameson would be like my new papa? Flynn's throat tightened with emotion. If you like that, Tim, nothing would make me prouder than to be your papa. Tim considered this seriously for all of 2 seconds before breaking into a wide grin. Does this mean I definitely get my own horse? Flynn laughed, relief and joy washing over him. Yes, partner, it definitely does. Then I think it's a great idea, Tim declared. Delilah smiled through her tears. Well, there you have it, Flynn. It seems we accept your proposal. Flynn's heart felt like it might burst with happiness. He slipped the ring onto Delilah's finger, then pulled her into his arms, mindful of the baby between them. I promise to spend every day making you glad you said yes, he whispered before kissing her softly. Tim watched with interest rather than disgust, which Flynn took as another good sign. When can we move to the ranch? The boy asked practically. Flynn looked to Delilah, leaving the decision to her. The house is ready whenever you are, he said. The roof will be finished by tomorrow, and I've had the inside cleaned thoroughly. We should wait until after the wedding, Delilah said, a blush coloring her cheeks. For propriety's sake. Flynn nodded, understanding. Of course. And when would you like that to be? Soon, she answered without hesitation. I don't see any reason to wait, do you? Not a single one, Flynn agreed fervently. And so it was decided. They would marry in 2 weeks' time, at the Sweetwater church with Reverend Parker officiating. Sheriff Ellis would give Delilah away, and Tim would serve as Flynn's best man, a role the boy accepted with solemn pride when asked. That evening, when Flynn escorted Delilah and the children back to the boarding house, they shared their news with Sheriff Ellis, who congratulated them with genuine warmth. Can't say I'm surprised, the sheriff said, shaking Flynn's hand. Never seen Delilah light up around anyone the way she does with you. Robert would approve, I think. He always wanted her happiness above all else. Those words meant more to Flynn than he could express. Thank you, Sheriff. That means a great deal coming from you. Reckon you should start calling me Wade, Ellis replied with a hint of a smile. Seeing as we're about to be family. The following 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Flynn finished the repairs on the ranch house while Delilah packed up their belongings and prepared for the move. The ladies of the church organized a small wedding celebration, and Mrs. Holloway insisted on baking the cake herself with all the necessary seasonings. She assured Delilah with a wink. Word spread quickly through Sweetwater, and to Flynn's surprise, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. The town had watched their courtship unfold, and seemed to approve of the match. Even Loretta from the saloon stopped Flynn on the street one afternoon to offer her congratulations. "You really did fall for her, didn't you?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Completely," Flynn confirmed without hesitation. Loretta shook her head in wonder. "Never thought I'd see the day Flynn Jameson was tamed, but I have to admit, you two suit each other. She's a lucky woman." "I'm the lucky one," Flynn corrected her gently. The day before the wedding, Flynn rode into town for the final time as a bachelor. He had a few last errands to run, including a stop at the jeweler's to pick up the wedding bands he'd ordered. As he was leaving the shop, he nearly collided with a woman on the boardwalk. "Pardon me, madam," he began automatically, then froze when he recognized her. "Mrs. Peterson." The banker's wife sniffed slightly, adjusting her hat. "Mr. Jameson. I understand congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Flynn replied stiffly, remembering her unkind gossip about Delilah. Mrs. Peterson seemed to hesitate, then said, "I owe you an apology, Mr. Jameson. I misjudged your intentions toward Mrs. Ellis. It seems you truly care for her and her children." Surprised by the admission, Flynn nodded. "I do, very much." "Well then," Mrs. Peterson said, her expression softening slightly, "I wish you both every happiness. Delilah Ellis is a fine woman who deserves a good husband. I hope you'll prove to be that for her." "I intend to," Flynn assured her. "Every day for the rest of my life." With a slight nod, Mrs. Peterson continued on her way, leaving Flynn bemused but pleased by the encounter. It seemed the last potential obstacle to their happiness had been removed. That evening, following tradition, Flynn stayed at the hotel while Delilah remained at the boarding house. Tim insisted on staying with Flynn, declaring it a men's night, which both amused and touched Flynn deeply. As they prepared for bed, Tim grew unusually quiet. "Something on your mind, partner?" Flynn asked, sitting on the edge of the bed beside the boy. Tim fidgeted with the edge of the blanket. "When you marry Mama tomorrow, will I call you Papa?" Flynn's heart constricted with emotion. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, Tim. Flynn is fine, or Mr. Jameson if you prefer. But yes, if you'd like to call me Papa, nothing would make me prouder." Tim nodded, considering this. "My real Papa died when I was little. I don't remember him very much." He looked up, his young face serious. "But Mama says he was brave and kind and that he loved me a lot." "I'm sure he did," Flynn said softly. "I think—" Tim paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think it's okay to have two papas. One in heaven and one here. Don't you?" Flynn had to swallow hard against the lump in his throat. "Yes, Tim. I think that's perfectly okay." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good. Then I'll call you Papa, if that's all right." "That's more than all right," Flynn assured him, pulling Tim into a hug that the boy returned with surprising strength. "Now, we'd better get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." As Tim drifted off to sleep beside him, Flynn stared up at the ceiling, marveling at how completely his life had changed in just a few short months. From a footloose cowboy with no ties to a man about to become a husband and father overnight. And yet, it felt more right than anything ever had. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, a perfect October morning with just enough chill in the air to hint at the coming winter. Flynn awoke early, his stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Beside him, Tim still slept soundly, his sandy hair tousled against the pillow. Flynn watched him for a moment, this boy who had so unexpectedly become a son to him, and felt a surge of protective love so powerful it nearly took his breath away. By day's end, he would be a husband and a father, roles he never aspired to, yet now couldn't imagine living without. "Tim," he said softly, gently shaking the boy's shoulder. "Time to wake up, partner. It's a big day." Tim stirred, blinking sleepily. "Is it morning already? Are you marrying Mama today?" Flynn chuckled. "That's the plan. But first, we need to get ourselves cleaned up and looking presentable." "Can't have the best man looking anything less than perfect, now can we?" The boy sat up, suddenly wide awake. "I'm really your best man?" "Absolutely," Flynn confirmed. "No one I'd rather have standing beside me." They dressed in their finest clothes, Flynn in a new black suit he'd ordered from the tailor, and Tim in a smaller version that made him look older than his years. After a quick breakfast at the hotel restaurant, they walked to the barber shop for a trim and shave, though in Tim's case, it was just a trim and a splash of bay rum that made him beam with pride. By 11 o'clock, they were at the church, greeting the early arrivals and accepting congratulations. Flynn was touched by how many townspeople had come to witness the ceremony. It seemed all of Sweetwater had turned out for the occasion. "Nervous?" Sheriff Ellis Wade asked, joining Flynn near the altar. "A little," Flynn admitted. "Not about marrying Delilah, that's the easiest decision I've ever made. Just about measuring up, I suppose. Being the husband and father they deserve." Wade nodded, understanding. "That feeling never goes away, from what I recall of my own wedding day. But for what it's worth, I think you'll do just fine. You've already proven yourself more committed than most men would be." "Thank you," Flynn said, genuinely grateful for the vote of confidence. "That means a lot coming from you." Wade clapped him on the shoulder. "I'd better go check on the bride. Nearly time." As the church filled and Reverend Parker took his place at the altar, Flynn felt an overwhelming sense of rightness. This was where he was meant to be, who he was meant to be. The piano began to play, and the assembled guests rose to their feet. Flynn's breath caught in his throat as Delilah appeared in the doorway on Wade's arm, with Mrs. Holloway following behind, carrying Grace. Delilah wore a dress of pale gold satin that complemented her chestnut hair and amber eyes perfectly. It wasn't quite a nod to the fact that this was her second marriage, but she looked every bit the radiant bride. Her hair was arranged in an elegant twist with tiny white flowers woven throughout, and she carried a small bouquet of autumn blooms. But it was her smile, wide, genuine, and directed solely at Flynn, that nearly brought him to his knees. Tim, standing proud beside Flynn, whispered in awe, "Mama looks like an angel." "That she does," Flynn agreed hoarsely. The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur for Flynn. He remembered saying his vows, his voice steady and sure despite the emotion welling in his chest. He remembered Delilah's eyes shimmering with unshed tears as she promised to love and honor him. And he remembered the moment Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife, the surge of joy that filled him as he kissed his bride for the first time as Flynn Jameson, married man. But mostly, he remembered the feeling of Delilah's hand in his as they turned to face their friends and neighbors, and the sight of Tim beaming up at them both, and Grace cooing happily in Mrs. Holloway's arms. His family. His future. The celebration afterward was held at the hotel, where the dining room had been decorated with autumn leaves and flowers. There was music and dancing, a feast prepared by the hotel kitchen, and Mrs. Holloway's magnificent cake, which lived up to all her promises. Flynn danced with his new wife, holding her closer than might be strictly proper but unable to bear any more distance between them than absolutely necessary. They had decided to spend their wedding night at the hotel before traveling to the ranch the following morning to begin their life together. "Happy, Mrs. Jameson?" Flynn murmured as they swayed to the music. Delilah's smile was radiant. "Impossibly so, Mr. Jameson. And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this has all been a dream." "Not a dream," she said softly, her hand warm in his. "Our new reality." As the celebration continued around them, Flynn found himself wondering at the path that had led him here. 6 months ago, he had been a drifter with no thought of settling down, a man with a reputation for loving and leaving. And now he was a husband, a father, a landowner, a man with responsibilities and connections that anchored him firmly to this place and these people. The change should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, Flynn stood on the front porch of the ranch house, a cup of hot coffee warming his hands as he surveyed his domain. The winter had been mild so far, allowing him to complete all the planned repairs to the buildings and even begin work on expanding the corrals for the additional horses he intended to purchase in the spring. Inside, he could hear Delilah moving about the kitchen, the soft clatter of pots and pans, a domestic symphony that still brought a smile to his face each morning. Tim was likely still asleep. The boy had been up late the night before, excitedly awaiting Flynn's return from a trip to the neighboring ranch where he'd gone to examine a potential breeding stallion. Life as a family man suited Flynn far better than anyone, himself included, might have predicted. The days fell into a pleasant rhythm, early mornings working the ranch with occasional help from hired hands, afternoons often spent with Tim teaching him the basics of ranching and horsemanship, evenings around the dinner table sharing stories and plans, and nights in Delilah's arms, discovering the depths of passion that could exist between a man and woman truly in love. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were adjustments to be made on all sides. Flynn had to learn patience with a young boy's endless questions and a baby's unpredictable needs. Delilah had to adapt to Flynn's occasional restlessness, his need to ride the boundaries of the property alone, sometimes to clear his head. But they worked through each challenge together, their commitment to building a life stronger than any momentary friction. And with each passing day, their bond only deepened. The sound of the door opening behind him pulled Flynn from his thoughts. Delilah stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, and joined him at the porch railing. "You're up early," she observed, leaning into his side. "Everything all right?" Flynn slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "Everything's perfect. Just enjoying the quiet before the day begins." She followed his gaze out over the property, the barn and corrals, the fields now dormant for winter, the distant hills touched with the pink light of dawn. "It is beautiful, isn't it? Especially in this light." "Not half as beautiful as you," Flynn replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. Delilah laughed softly. "Charmer! Even after 3 months of marriage." "Especially after 3 months of marriage," he corrected her. "I find more to admire every day." She turned in his arms, her expression growing more serious. "Flynn, there's something I need to tell you." A flicker of concern passed through him at her tone. "What is it, love? Is something wrong?" "Not wrong," she assured him quickly. "Just unexpected. Or perhaps not so unexpected, considering." A blush colored her cheeks. "Flynn, I believe I'm with child." For a moment, Flynn couldn't process her words. Then understanding dawned, and with it a joy so profound it left him momentarily speechless. "A baby?" he finally managed. "Our baby?" Delilah nodded, her eyes searching his face. "I've suspected for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. I saw Doc Wilson yesterday while you were at the Thornton Ranch. He confirmed it. The baby should come in late summer." Flynn let out a whoop of delight, lifting Delilah off her feet and spinning her around on the porch. "A baby! Delilah, that's wonderful news!" Her laughter joined his, bright and joyful in the morning air. "So you're pleased, then?" "Pleased? I'm ecstatic." Flynn set her gently back on her feet, then dropped to his knees before her, pressing a reverential kiss to her still flat stomach through her dress. "Hello in there, little one. I'm your papa, and I already love you more than you can imagine." Tears of happiness shimmered in Delilah's eyes as she stroked Flynn's hair. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Flynn Jameson. You already are to Tim and Grace." Flynn rose to his feet, gathering her close again. "Thank you for this gift, Delilah. For all of it, Tim, Grace, this new little one, our life together." I never knew such happiness existed until you showed me. The sound of small feet pattering across the floor inside alerted them that Tim was awake. A moment later, the door burst open and the boy appeared, his hair tousled from sleep. Papa! You're home! Tim launched himself at Flynn, who caught him easily in a one-armed hug, keeping his other arm around Delilah. Did you see the horse? Is he big? Can I meet him? Flynn laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. Yes to all of those questions. And we have some news for you, partner. How would you feel about being a big brother again? Tim's eyes widened. Mama's having a baby? Like Grace? That's right, Delilah confirmed, smiling. But this baby will be a little brother or sister to both you and Grace. Tim considered this information seriously. I hope it's a brother, he decided. But a sister would be okay too, I guess. He looked up at Flynn. Will the new baby like horses? Flynn exchanged an amused glance with Delilah. I imagine they will, with you to teach them all about it. This answer seemed to satisfy Tim, who proceeded to pepper them with questions about when the baby would arrive and where it would sleep and whether it would need to be taught to talk, just as he was helping teach Grace. As they all went inside for breakfast, Grace's morning babble already audible from her cradle in the corner of the kitchen, Flynn felt a sense of completeness that still amazed him daily. A year ago, he had been a man alone, drifting from place to place, taking pride in his independence and his reputation as a heartbreaker. If anyone had told him then that his greatest joy would come from a widow with children in her arms, from becoming a husband and father, from putting down roots on a patch of Texas soil, he would have laughed in disbelief. Yet here he was, surrounded by a family of his own making, with another child on the way, feeling more content and fulfilled than he'd ever imagined possible. Flynn Jameson, the cowboy who once could have had any woman he wanted, had chosen the one woman who could give him what he truly needed: a home, a family, a purpose. And in doing so, he had found not just love, but his true self. As he sat at the table with Delilah serving breakfast and Tim chattering excitedly about horses and babies, Grace cooing from her cradle, Flynn knew with absolute certainty that he would never desire to wander again. Everything he could ever want was right here, within these walls, within the circle of his arms. He had found his place in the world, and it was by their side.